Alright, this is it, y'all. This is the last episode of Season 2 of the History of the United States. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the second century of American history. It has been an absolute blast. Now, if you're wondering why am I doing this goofy hand motion, well, it's because we are talking about the frontier today. And one of my favorite things about making these videos is that every once in a while, I get to use my hands to represent the vast, undeveloped wilderness of North America. Look at this. Look at that. Man, it feels good to be able to stretch out my hands and just be like, here's a bunch of trees. Anyway, in our last episode, we talked about how Americans began to move westward into the huge swath of land known as the Great American Desert, or as the U.S. government more optimistically called it, the Oregon Country. Today, we're going to see what happened when those Americans met the various native nations who also called the region home. Now, before we dive in, let's make sure everyone understands the geography of the situation. Okay, so right off the bat, let me just say there was not one single thing called the Oregon Country. It was just a term the U.S. government used to describe the lands west of the Rocky Mountains that they were interested in annexing. But the geography of this region is pretty complicated. Like, first of all, the Rocky Mountains run through it. That's a big deal. Also, most of the land is high desert, which probably explains why the U.S. government called it a desert. But even within that desert, there are three very distinct regions. There's the Great Basin, which is mostly dry, flat land, with lots of small lakes, like Utah and Nevada. Then there's the Columbia River Valley and the Willamette Valley, which have fertile soil and abundant rainfall. Finally, you've got the California coastal region, which is basically Mediterranean in its climate. And then, of course, you have the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Mountain Ranges, which contain some of the tallest mountains in North America. But the most important geographic feature in this region for our story today is the Columbia River. See, the Columbia River starts in British Canada, flows south through the Columbia River Valley, which contains the Willamette Valley, and then empties into the Pacific Ocean north of San Francisco. And control of this river was key to controlling all of these lands. Okay, now let's talk about the people. As we discussed in our last video, the first Europeans to explore the Oregon Country were the Spanish. And after them came the British and the Russians. And by the 1820s, both Britain and Spain had established colonies in the region. But it was during the 1840s that the United States really started sending settlers into the area. And almost immediately, those settlers came into conflict with the native nations who had lived there for centuries. Now, oversimplifying here, but there were two main native groups in the region. There were the tribes of the Great Basin, like the Shoshone and the Bannock, who were generally nomadic hunter-gatherers, and then the tribes of the Columbia River Valley, like the Chinook and the Clatsop, who were more settled agriculturalists. And the U.S. government hoped that buying the lands from the tribes of the Great Basin would be relatively easy. So they sent representatives out to negotiate treaties. But the tribes of the Great Basin weren't really interested in selling their lands, so negotiations went poorly. Meanwhile, in the Willamette Valley, things were going even worse. You see, by the 1840s, word had gotten around among the tribes of the Columbia River Valley that the Americans were coming, and they knew that they needed to do something to stop them. So in June of 1842, the tribes rose up and attacked several American settlements, killing hundreds of American men, women, and children. The Americans naturally were pretty upset about this. They responded by sending out military forces to put down this so-called Indian War. And after years of fighting, the U.S. Army prevailed. But the war was costly in terms of lives on both sides. And as always, the real tragedy was that both sides suffered needless loss of life. Because if these two sides could have communicated effectively, they might have been able to reach some kind of compromise. But they didn't. And that's kind of the story of the entire era of native settler relations on the frontier. It's important to remember that neither Native Americans nor European Americans were a monolith. We're talking about hundreds of different nations and tribes and peoples, each with their own languages and cultures and histories. And yet, despite their differences, they were all lumped together by Europeans as Indians and forced to sign blanket treaties that did not represent their interests. At the same time, European Americans were also not a monolith. And yet they were united by their desire to acquire land west of the Mississippi River. For many Americans, acquiring land was the only way they could advance their economic status. And others simply wanted to escape the growing population and congestion of the East Coast. But the result of all this was that Americans kept pushing further and further west, dispossessing Native Americans of their lands with very little regard for their cultures or histories. By the 1840s, the U.S. government had purchased most of the lands that were east of the Mississippi River, and so now their sights were set on the Oregon country. As we talked about in our last video, thousands of Americans began heading out to the Oregon country, and that caused conflict with the Native Americans who already lived there. But by the 1850s, Americans had pushed all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and they turned their attention to the vast interior of what is today the American West, in order to understand what happened next. Though we need to look at another region, Texas. By the 1850s, Texas was still a republic, but it was being pressured by the U.S. government to join the Union. On the one hand, the government of Texas was struggling to pay its debts, and so economically, it made sense to join the United States and get access to all that federal funding. But on the other hand, Texas was afraid that if they joined the U.S., then the federal government would force them to abolish slavery, which obviously wasn't going to happen. Okay, so you know where this is going. The compromise was that the United States agreed to purchase Texas's claim to all this land up here, and in exchange, Texas would join the United States as a slave state, and everyone was happy, right? No, they weren't. See, that land that Texas sold to the U.S. government was the land that the U.S. government had previously purchased from the indigenous tribes. And those indigenous tribes were not cool with their lands being taken from them again. So just like in the Oregon country, the U.S. Army had to go out and fight wars against the tribes to remove them from the lands that the U.S. government claimed to own. But there was one major difference between the situation in the Oregon country and the situation in Texas. In the Oregon country, the United States didn't have a clear legal or territorial claim.
Oh.
They just showed up and decided it was theirs. In Texas, the U.S. government did have a legal claim based on treaties they signed with the Spanish, the Mexican government, and most recently, Texas. So the U.S. government had a stronger case in Texas, and as a result, Native Americans were removed from the region much more quickly. And all of this played right into the narrative of manifest destiny, which held that Americans were destined by God to expand their civilization across the continent. Now, that's a topic for an entirely new video. But suffice it to say that manifest destiny was a powerful motivator for Americans to acquire more land and to remove Native Americans from that land, and so by the end of the 1850s, Americans had acquired all the land that they wanted, at least for now. What happens next, you ask? Well, that's going to have to wait until next season, so please stay tuned. In the meantime, check out my video on the causes of the Civil War, which will premiere right here on October. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you then. Bye.